In every city, there are streets the streetlights forget. Places where the fog doesn't lift, it settles. Into the bones. Into the records. Into cases no one wants reopened. They told her it would be simple. Walk in. Walk out. Don't look back. But nothing in this world stays buried. And everyone looks back, eventually. Some crimes don't end when the sirens fade. They send out waves. Through testimony. Through memory. Through the people who survive them. They reverberate.
Help me.
This is one of those cases. This is reverberating noir.
Picture this: Paris, 1764. A city of candlelight and cobblestones, of powdered wigs and gilded concert halls, of music so refined it could make a grown man weep into his wine, and somewhere in the darkest, most forgotten corner of that glittering city, in a cramped house on a street that smelled of rot and river water, one of the greatest musicians who ever lived was lying dead on his own floor, stabbed 3 times, fully dressed, on his back, in a pool of blood that had long since gone cold, and nobody had noticed. Not for days.
That detail alone, the fact that it took days for anyone to find him, tells you everything you need to know about how Jean-Marie Leclair died. Not just the stabbing, but the isolation. A man who had once played for the King of France died alone, in a slum, and the world kept moving.
Welcome to the show. I'm Adam Jones.
And I'm Nina Jovovich, and today we're going back, way back, to one of the oldest unsolved murders in the history of Western music. A case with no conviction, no confession, and no closure. Even now, more than 260 years later.
This is the story of Jean-Marie Leclair, virtuoso, pioneer, and the victim of a murder that history never solved. Let's start with who this man actually was. Because I think a lot of people hear Baroque composer, and their eyes glaze over. And I need them to understand this was not some dusty footnote. Jean-Marie Leclair was a genuine revolutionary.
He really was. And what makes him fascinating, even before we get to the murder, is how improbable his entire career was. He was born in Lyon in 1697. And he didn't start as a musician. He started as a dancer. A ballet master, actually.
Which is not what you expect from the man who essentially built the French violin school from the ground up.
Right. But think about what dance training gives you. Rhythm, physical precision, an instinct for performance as a full-body experience. When he eventually picked up the violin seriously in his early 20s, which is late by any classical standard, he brought all of that with him.
He travelled to Turin. He absorbed the Italian masters Corelli, Vivaldi, that whole tradition of technical brilliance and emotional directness. And then he came home to France and did something genuinely hard. He didn't just copy what he'd learned. He translated it. He filtered it through the French sensibility, the elegance, the ornamentation, the structural restraint, and created something entirely new.
His 4 books of violin sonatas are still considered landmarks of the Baroque repertoire. He played for Louis XV. He worked for some of the most powerful patrons in Paris. By any measure, he had made it.
And yet, by 1764, he was 67 years old, separated from his wife, and living in one of the most dangerous neighbourhoods in Paris. Not by accident, by choice.
That's the part that gets me every time. He chose to be there. The neighborhood was called the Cour des Orfèvres Goldsmiths Court near the Châtelet. And it was rough. It was genuinely dangerous. This was not the address of a celebrated musician enjoying his retirement. This was the address of someone who, for whatever reason, wanted to disappear.
And disappear he did. October the 23rd, 1764, morning. A gardener named Paracel arrived at the house as usual. The doors were locked. The house was completely still. He looked through a ground-floor window. And there he was. Jean-Marie Leclair. On the floor near the entrance hall. On his back. Fully dressed. Not moving.
The police forced their way in. And what the autopsy revealed was significant, not just in terms of cause of death, but in terms of what it told them about the killer. 3 stab wounds, 1 to the back, 1 to the stomach, and a third, the fatal one, to the left side of the chest.
3 stabs. That's not opportunistic. That's not a robbery that got out of hand.
Exactly. From a behavioral standpoint, the wound pattern tells a story. The blow to the back suggests the attack may have begun from behind, possibly while Leclair was turned away, unsuspecting. Then the stomach, then the chest. That's not frenzied. That's purposeful. That's someone who came to finish something.
And then there's the detail that changes everything. No forced entry. None. No broken windows. No damaged locks. The doors were locked from the inside or secured after the fact, which means one of 2 things. Leclair opened the door himself, or the killer already had a key.
Either way, this was someone he knew. Someone he trusted enough or feared enough to let into his home. In a neighborhood like that, at that hour, you don't open the door to strangers.
Which is what made the investigation so personal, so uncomfortable. Because the answers, if there were any, weren't going to come from the street. They were going to come from the people closest to him. 2 names kept surfacing. 2 people with motive, with access, and with a history complicated enough to make either of them plausible. The first was his nephew, Guillaume-François Vial.
Vial is, look, if this were a modern true crime case, he'd be the person everyone on the internet had already convicted by day 2. The profile is almost uncomfortably clean. He was an engraver. He'd learned the craft from his uncle. He worked for him. And he resented him.
Now, for people who don't know, engraving in this period wasn't just a technical job, it was an economic one. When Leclair engraved his own compositions, he controlled how they were reproduced and sold. He controlled the income. He controlled the quality, he controlled everything, and Vial, working under him, was always going to be subordinate, always going to be second.
There were rumors of arguments, bitter ones, and more damaging still accusations that Vial had tried to pass off some of his own inferior engravings as his uncle's work. If that's true, think about what that means. That's not just dishonesty. That's an attack on Leclair's reputation, his legacy, the thing he cared about most.
And then after the murder, the behaviour. Vial moved quickly, almost too quickly. He sought control of his uncle's unpublished manuscripts, his personal effects. Not with the hesitation of a grieving man, with the certainty of someone who felt he was owed.
That post-offense behavior is significant. We see it in modern cases all the time. The person who inserts themselves into the investigation, who moves to claim assets, who seems not devastated, but relieved. It doesn't prove guilt, but it is a pattern.
And yet, no charges, no arrest. Vial lived out the rest of his life forever wrapped in suspicion, but never held accountable for a single thing.
Which brings us to the second suspect. And honestly, she's the more complicated figure of the 2.
Louise Roussel, Leclair's estranged wife.
And I want to be careful here, because Louise Roussel is often reduced to the bitter ex-wife. And that does her a disservice even if she was a suspect. She was a skilled engraver. A publisher. A professional woman operating in a field that was not exactly welcoming to professional women in the 1700s.
For years, she and Leclair were genuine partners. She engraved his later publications. She was part of the work, part of the identity. And then the marriage ended, bitterly.
The exact reasons are still murky. What we know is that their separation wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the unraveling of an entire shared enterprise, creative, financial, personal, all at once. And that kind of loss, that kind of betrayal, can calcify into something very dark over time.
The police took her seriously as a suspect. The theories ranged from the possibility that she had acted directly to the suggestion that she may have arranged for someone else to do it. But like Vial, no evidence. No charges. Nothing.
What strikes me about both suspects is not just that they had motive and access. It's that both of them were people whose entire professional identities were entangled with Leclair's. His work was their work. His reputation touched theirs. His death, depending on who you were, could be either devastating or liberating.
And we still don't know which it was. There is one detail about this crime scene that I keep coming back to. One thing that, even stripped of any romanticism, just sits with you.
The manuscript.
The manuscript. When investigators searched Leclair's home, they found something on his desk. A piece of music he had been working on, ink barely dry. The title of the piece, and I want you to really hear this, was Plaintes, Laments.
The last thing Jean-Marie Leclair was writing before someone walked through his door and killed him was a piece called Laments.
And reportedly, the manuscript was stained with his blood.
Now, I'll be honest, that detail has likely been polished by 2.5 centuries of retelling. History does that. It smooths the rough edges and sharpens the poetry. But even if you set aside the blood, even if you treat it purely as a factual artifact, a half-finished score on a dead man's desk, titled Laments, that is still one of the most quietly devastating details I have ever encountered in a case.
It's the kind of detail that makes you feel the loss differently. Not just the loss of a man, but the loss of whatever came next. The music that never got finished. The notes that stayed silent.
And that, I think, is what makes cold cases from this era so uniquely painful. It's not just that the murder went unsolved. It's that the absence of justice meant the absence of a full story. We don't know who did this. We don't know. Why not, really? We don't know what Leclair knew in those final moments. Whether he was surprised, whether he recognized the face above him, whether he understood.
The investigation eventually stalled. The police of pre-revolutionary Paris were not equipped for a case like this. No forensic science, no systematic evidence collection, no way to bridge the gap between strong suspicion and legal proof. Without a confession or a witness, there was nowhere left to go. The case was closed, unsolved.
And both suspects, Vial and Roussel, went on with their lives. Vial for many years, carrying whatever he knew or didn't know, surrounded by the manuscripts he'd claimed. Louise Roussel, continuing her work, her name still attached to publications that bore her late husband's genius.
And the truth, if there ever was a single, clean truth to this, died with whoever was in that room.
What I keep returning to when I think about this case analytically is the question of isolation. Leclair chose to be alone. He chose that neighborhood. He chose that house. He chose the kind of life that meant no one noticed his absence for days. And in doing so, he created the exact conditions that made his murder both possible and unsolvable.
There's something almost Greek about that. The idea that the choices a person makes, even the small, quiet ones, can become the architecture of their own undoing. He built the walls of his isolation himself. And those walls kept the world out long enough for someone to finish what they came to do.
And long enough for the evidence to go cold, literally and figuratively.
Jean-Marie Leclair, born in 1697, died on the 22nd of October, 1764. A man who revolutionized the way the violin was played in France, who fused two musical worlds into something entirely his own, who played for kings, and who died on a cold floor in a forgotten neighborhood with a half-finished lament on his desk and no one coming to find him.
The most likely suspect remains Guillaume-François Vial. The motive was real. The access was real. The behavior afterward was damning, but most likely is not justice. And 260 years of suspicion is not a verdict.
What we're left with is the music, the sonatas, the concerti, the exquisite, demanding, luminous work of a man who spent his life chasing perfection and, by most accounts, came very close to finding it. That music still exists. It is still played. It still rewards anyone willing to sit with it.
And somewhere underneath it, if you listen in a certain way, you might just hear the shape of something unresolved. A question that was never answered. A door that was opened one autumn night in Paris and never properly closed.
Some silences are permanent. If this episode stayed with you, and I hope it did, subscribe to the channel, leave us a comment with your theory. Was it Vial? Was it Roussel? Was it someone we haven't even considered? We read every single one. And if you know someone who loves history, true crime, or just a mystery that refuses to let go, send them this episode. We'll see you next time. Stay curious, stay questioning, and never stop asking why.
And so the file closes. But the case doesn't. Not for the families. Not for the witnesses who still pause before answering questions. Not for a city that remembers, even when it pretends not to. The evidence sits somewhere in a box. The photographs fade. The names are spoken less often. but the echoes remain. If this story stayed with you, if you felt that silence at the end of each unanswered question, subscribe to the channel. Not for us, for the stories that never got a second look, for the voices that were cut short, for the cases that refused to stay buried. Because the truth doesn't disappear. It waits.
And as long as the questions are still unanswered, the case isn't over. It's just waiting for someone to look again.
And here, it keeps reverberating.